This is the story of a woman whose name is forever carved into the darkest chapters of world history. Fanny Kaplan, a figure shrouded in shadows, fear, and political myth. Her name once echoed through newspapers, prosecutors' demands, and fearful whispers in candlelit kitchens. She became the ultimate symbol of the strike against the revolution's leader, the woman who allegedly raised her hand against Vladimir Lenin himself. But who was she really? A fanatical terrorist, or a victim of someone else's game? A cold-blooded killer, or a pawn in a massive political gambit? We will descend into the archives, recount forgotten testimonies, and weigh the contradictory facts. We will attempt to uncover who Fanny Kaplan really was and why her image continues to ignite fierce debate even more than a century later. Moscow under the gun. The end of August, 1918. Moscow lives in a state of continuous fear and the anticipation of disaster. The city, which only yesterday celebrated the victory of the revolution, today resembles a fortress under siege. Red Guard patrols are everywhere. There are anxious conversations about counter-revolution and rumors of impending assassinations. Newspapers are published with headlines about mutinies at the front, uprisings in the provinces, mysterious murders of Bolsheviks, and enigmatic arrests. At this very moment, no one suspects that in a few hours, events will occur that will change the course of history for the young Soviet Republic. Late in the evening of the 30th of August, shots will ring out on the territory of the Michelson plant, shots that will nearly send the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin to his grave. And the name of the person accused of this attempt will be forever written into the annals of the country as a symbol of terror, an embodiment of a sinister conspiracy against the power of the Soviets. That name is Fanny Kaplan. But who was she really? A mad fanatic, obsessed with hatred for the Bolsheviks? An experienced terrorist, ready to die for her convictions? Or a victim of political games, a person who found herself in the right place at the right time to become a scapegoat? To answer these questions, we must return to the past. We must follow the paths taken by Feyga Roydman, a girl from a poor Jewish family who became a figure whose name, more than a century later, is shrouded in secrets and myths. We must understand what could have pushed her onto the path of the revolutionary underground. We must analyze the contradictory protocols of the investigation, where words are confused with guesses, and confessions sit alongside obvious absurdities. Our investigation is an attempt to reconstruct the chronology of her life and her final days. We will raise archival documents, Cheka reports, eyewitness accounts, and the versions of historians who have argued for decades about whether Kaplan actually fired the shots. We will examine how the day of the assassination attempt was organized, why the evidence disappeared, and why the main accused was executed without trial or investigation, secretly, at night, in the backyard of the Kremlin. This will be neither a justification nor an accusation. This is an attempt to understand. Who was Fanny Kaplan? A terrorist, a fanatic, a pawn in a big game, or just a name inserted into history to hide the real shooters? Through 10 chapters, step by step, we will follow her path, attempting to look at her through the eyes of her contemporaries and those who, decades later, tried to dig down to the truth. Before us is a dossier in which facts, rumors, distortions, and state secrets are intertwined. And perhaps, after this investigation, we will be able to get closer to solving one of the most controversial mysteries of the revolutionary era, the mystery of Fanny Kaplan and the shots that could have changed the entire 20th century. Moscow in turmoil. Shots at the Michelson plant. Moscow, the 30th of August, 1918. The city lives in tension. On the streets, armed patrols, suspicious glances, and rumors of new conspiracies against the Soviet power. The power of the Bolsheviks is still too young and fragile to feel safe. Enemies are everywhere, in the villages, in the army, among former allies of the revolution. On this evening, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin heads to the Michelson plant to speak to the workers. The atmosphere around the plant resembles a small military camp. Guards, document checks, and the tense faces of security personnel. But the habit of danger has already become part of the everyday life of the revolutionary leader. Lenin comes out to the workers, and his short speech is full of optimism and calls for mobilization. After the speech, he heads to the car. At this moment, a woman appears between the crowd and the car. She seems to emerge from nowhere. 3 shots tear through the air. 2 bullets find their target, one in the neck, the other in the shoulder. Lenin falls, and panic rises around him. Someone shouts, "Assassination!" Someone fires into the air, and the guards grab people near the site of the attack. Within minutes, the militia detains a woman whom witnesses point out as the shooter. Her name is Fanny Kaplan. They find a Browning revolver in her possession. According to the Cheka version, it was she who committed the attempt on the leader. But already at this moment, oddities appear that will cast doubt on the official version for decades. First, eyewitness accounts. Some claim the shooter was a man, others that there were more than 3 shots, and still others say they were fired from 2 different points. But the Cheka is in a hurry. The main task is not to find the truth, but to show the country that the culprit has been found and the revolution is under control. The wounded Lenin is urgently taken to the Kremlin, where doctors decide not to remove the bullet from his neck, fearing a fatal outcome. News of the attempt spreads through Moscow, and a state of emergency is declared in the city. By the decision of the leadership, the Red Terror begins, a wave of repressions against those considered enemies of the new power. Meanwhile, Fanny Kaplan is placed in a special department of the Cheka. She is not beaten, but interrogations follow one after another. She refuses to admit guilt in the direct sense of the word. She says she did not want Lenin's death, that she considered him a traitor to the revolution, but she supposedly could not have fired. After her previous term in hard labor, her eyesight was almost gone. And here the first inconsistency arises. How could an almost blind woman hit a moving target at a distance of a few steps in the dark with a revolver requiring precise aiming? Despite the doubts, official bulletins have already been released. The attempt was committed by the socialist revolutionary Fanny Kaplan. The investigation moves rapidly toward a preordained finale. None of the Cheka leadership, including Dzerzhinsky, demands a public trial. The country receives a simple explanation. Enemies of the revolution are raising their heads, but justice will overtake them swiftly and mercilessly. In those same days, the first alternative versions appear. Some claim that someone else fired, and Kaplan was an accidental victim of the guards. Others suspect a conspiracy within the Bolshevik Party itself, related to a struggle for power. But these conversations were quickly silenced. Any doubt was declared counter-revolutionary. Later, in the Cheka archives, historians will find documents that make them doubt the official version even more. Among them are interrogation transcripts in which Kaplan talks about her blindness and denies the shooting, witness descriptions that contradict each other, and the missing revolver, which was never presented at the trial. Which, in fact, never happened. This story began as a simple explanation. A terrorist shoots the leader. She is caught, punished, and the revolution goes on. But behind the facade of propaganda lies a much darker picture. And to understand it, one must go back to the past, learn who Fanny Kaplan was, why her path led to the Michelson plant, and what really happened that evening when Moscow heard the shots that nearly changed the world. A girl from Volhynia. The beginning of Feyga Roydman's journey. The history of the attempt on Vladimir Lenin, the history of Fanny Kaplan, cannot be understood without returning to her past. To understand who this woman is and how she found herself in the very center of one of the most mysterious pages of the revolution, one must go back to the last quarter of the 19th century, to the quiet towns of Volhynia, where a girl named Feyga Roydman was born. She was born on the 26th of February, 1893, into a poor Jewish family. Volhynia at that time was not about cozy villages and a calm life. It was hard labor, humiliation, poverty, and the constant fear of another pogrom. Jewish families lived in isolation, squeezed by the laws of the Russian Empire, which limited their rights in almost everything. Feyga's father, Roydman, was a shoemaker. He earned pennies, barely enough for bread and cheap grits. Her mother, Rachel, was engaged in housekeeping and sewing, earning extra money by helping neighbors. Feyga's childhood passed amid the shouts of markets, the smell of smoke from stoves, and adults' conversations about poverty, injustice, and the hope for change. From a very early age, the girl felt that life was a struggle for the right to be heard. She did not have the opportunity to study in a real school. Education for poor Jewish children remained a luxury. However, Feyga greedily caught every word from books she managed to obtain from rare wandering teachers or revolutionary-minded youth visiting the towns. Feyga's youth coincided with the growth of the revolutionary movement in the Russian Empire. News of injustices, worker and peasant riots, and terrorist acts against officials spread quickly, even to remote corners. These stories became part of her childhood dreams, of another, just life. By the age of 15, she already knew she did not want to remain in poverty, did not want to live under the weight of imperial laws. In these years, her character hardened. Persistence, fearlessness, and readiness to take risks became the hallmarks of her nature. But along with this, a desperate thirst for change, by any means, was born. At 16, Feyga leaves her parents' home. This decision becomes the first step on the path that will one day lead her into the center of a formidable political storm. She travels by hitchhiking and on foot, takes odd jobs, and meets people involved in the revolutionary movement. During these years, she first hears the ideas of anarchists, socialists, and socialist revolutionaries. Every new acquaintance leaves a mark, shaping her political passion and hatred for the injustice of the czarist system. The turning point is her meeting with underground groups ready for terror as a method of struggle. For the young revolutionaries of that time, terror seemed to be the only language the government was willing to hear. Feyga accepts this logic without hesitation, convinced that any evil is justified if it destroys a more terrible evil, the tyranny and poverty of millions. These years lay the foundation for her future path. Rebellion against the system, readiness to risk her life, and a desire to be part of a great struggle. But it is during this period that her destiny encounters its first blows. Failed operations, the first arrests, and the first betrayals by associates. Soon, Feyga will fall into a whirlpool of events that will change her life forever. The preparation for one of the most high-profile attempts on officials of the czarist regime, the failure of the operation, arrest, and hard labor. And it is there, in the conditions of hard labor, that her health will be permanently crippled and her eyesight almost lost. But that is still several years away. For now, she is just a girl from a poor Volhynian town, stubbornly going against fate. No one then could have imagined that the name Feyga Roydman, who became Fanny Kaplan, would one day thunder across all of Russia and be surrounded by secrets, guesses, and fear for decades to come. From the underground to hard labor. The birth of Fanny Kaplan. The beginning of the 20th century in the Russian Empire was a time when the revolution ceased to be a dream and became a bloody reality. In these years, the fate of the young Feyga Roydman is inextricably intertwined with the fate of the country, plunged into a chaos of terror, repression, and a desperate struggle for change. After leaving her home, the 16-year-old girl finds herself in Kiev, one of the centers of revolutionary underground activity. Here she first takes the name under which she will enter history, Fanny Kaplan. Legend has it that she took this pseudonym from a fellow revolutionary who died during an assassination attempt on an official. From this moment on, Fanny becomes her battle name, her shield, and her sword. In Kiev, she falls under the influence of the combat organization of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, preparing terrorist acts against representatives of the Tsarist regime. These people are young, desperate, and believe in the power of the bomb and the revolver as the only means of fighting tyranny. For Fanny, who grew up in an atmosphere of poverty and humiliation, their ideas become a revelation. She quickly masters the basics of conspiracy, safe houses, secret meetings, and bomb-making. Contemporaries described her as fanatical, fearless, and ready to risk herself for the cause of the revolution. At the same time, many noted her poor health and painful thinness. The girl literally exhausted herself with hardships and the constant tension of underground life. In 1906, her first serious action takes place. Fanny, along with a group of fighters, prepares an attempt on the governor of Kyiv. But the operation fails. The conspiracy is compromised, the police receive a tip-off, and an explosion occurs while attempting to transport the bombs. The explosion injures several participants, including Fanny herself. Arrest becomes inevitable. She is detained along with the remnants of the group. The investigation is conducted harshly but surprisingly quickly. The accusation is built on informant testimony, found explosives, and confessions of some associates. Fanny holds strong. During interrogations, she refuses to give up other participants, admitting her guilt partially, but without remorse. For her, this is not a crime, but a war against a state she considers the executioner of its own people. The trial takes place in Kiev at the beginning of 1907. The girl is only 17 years old, but she is already accused of terrorism and the attempt on the life of an official. The prosecutor demands the death penalty. However, her young age and incomplete investigative data save her from the gallows. The court sentences her to life in hard labor. The journey to hard labor becomes the first real hell in her life. Fanny is sent to Siberia, to the Akatui Katorga prison. The journey takes long months, in cold and mud, under guard. Many prisoners die on the way. Fanny survives, but her health is seriously compromised. Prison life means chains, exhausting labor, constant humiliation, and hunger. But the most terrible thing for the young woman is an eye disease developed after the failed explosion. Doctors at the prison hospital diagnose a severe damage to the optic nerve. Years of imprisonment lead to partial blindness. Fellow prisoners remembered her as a withdrawn but strong-willed girl. She spoke little but always held herself proudly, as if she were not a criminal, but a captive soldier of her revolution. Letters she sent to relatives and friends preserve the spirit of her unwavering faith. We suffer, but we do not give up. One day this world will become just. The katorga lasts nearly 10 years. This decade breaks many, but Fanny survives, although she loses her health completely. Her eyesight weakens so much that by the end of her term, she is almost blind in one eye, and the other distinguishes only silhouettes. In 1917, the revolution will break out, and the new government will announce an amnesty for political prisoners. Fanny will be released, but as a different woman, with a body broken by labor and a soul hardened by suffering and hatred for the old world. These years will become the key to understanding her further fate. The girl who took a bomb in her hands at 17, years later, blind, exhausted, but unbroken, will again find herself in the whirlpool of revolutionary Russia. And her name will yet ring out to the whole world as the name of the woman who shot Lenin. Amnesty and the return to revolution. The road to a new struggle. The February Revolution of 1917 opened the doors of prisons and hard labor camps, releasing those who only yesterday were called terrorists and enemies of the state. Among them was Fanny Kaplan, who had spent nearly a decade in exile and labor barracks. Amnesty came unexpectedly. News of the Tsar's overthrow reached the labor camp a few days after the events in Petrograd. The guards, who only recently held the prisoners in iron chains, now hurriedly prepared documents for their release. For Fanny, this moment was almost unreal. She was so accustomed to life in captivity that freedom seemed like a dream that was about to break. But the dream turned out to be reality. In the spring of 1917, she left the labor prison and headed west. According to contemporaries' memoirs, she looked sickly, pale, with weakened vision, fragile, but with the same steely gaze she possessed as a young underground fighter 10 years ago. First of all, Fanny headed to Kiev, where her remaining relatives lived. Here she tried to start a new life, but the years of hard labor left not only scars on her body, but also marks in the eyes of others. Former convicts were rarely accepted back into society. For many, they remained dangerous elements. In Kyiv, Fanny tries to treat her eyes. Medical records from those years are scarce, but it is known that the damage to the optic nerve was irreversible. She saw only partially, barely distinguishing the shapes of objects. In her words, later conveyed to investigators, there was bitterness. I was released almost blind. I saw only darkness, but I still wanted to live. Living turned out to be difficult. Without means of subsistence, without a profession, and with ruined health, Fanny got by with odd jobs. In her circle, former revolutionaries reappeared, many of whom had returned from exile and emigration. They talked about the new Russia, about dual power, and about the possibility of building a just world. However, former comrades in the socialist revolutionary movement had changed. The ranks of the party were divided, and disagreements appeared with the Bolsheviks, whom many socialist revolutionaries considered usurpers of the revolution. Fanny, who grew up on the ideals of the people's will, did not trust Lenin and his supporters. She believed that the new regime was moving toward a dictatorship, no less harsh than the Tsarist one. In the summer of 1917, Fanny leaves for Moscow. Here she tries to find her place among political groups, but nowhere does she stay for long. The Bolsheviks looked at her with suspicion. Former SR combatants were not trusted. The left SRs, on the contrary, considered her too detached from their modern struggle. Some historians claim that during this period, Fanny still hoped for a reconciliation of revolutionary forces, but having been disappointed, became a supporter of the radical path. In her notes from that time, if you believe the surviving drafts of letters, there are lines. "We fought for freedom, but we find ourselves in a cage once again. Now the cage is red, but the iron is the same." Her life after hard labor is one of constant moves, meetings with people from the past, secret gatherings, and a growing sense that the revolution was stolen from the people. She lived in cheap rooms, ate whatever she could find, and was sometimes on the verge of starvation. Several times she turned to old friends for help, but received only temporary support. Fanny was not broken, but she became different. From a bold young fighter grew a woman who had seen death, survived hard labor, and lost her health. Her worldview became even harsher. Now she believed in neither compromise nor the promises of power. In the autumn of 1917, the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. For Fanny, this was a signal. The revolution had finally gone where its heroes never dreamed. It is in these months that her personal hatred for Lenin and his party is born. She considered them traitors to those ideals for which young Fanny was ready to die in Kiev 10 years ago. From this moment on, her life begins to be linked to the underground again. She communicates with former socialist revolutionaries, conducts conversations about the struggle against the Bolsheviks, and attends meetings where conspiracies and plans for future uprisings are discussed. These years after hard labor prepared the ground for the tragic episode that will forever write Fanny Kaplan's name into history. But for now, it is only a road. The road of an exhausted woman who could not find peace and therefore found herself once again on the threshold of war. Underground connections and the first traces of a conspiracy. After the October Revolution of 1917, Russia plunged into chaos. The Bolsheviks seized power, proclaiming slogans of freedom and equality. But their methods of rule increasingly resembled a dictatorship. Fanny Kaplan, who had returned from hard labor only a few months prior, observed what was happening with bitterness and growing hatred. By the beginning of 1918, she was already in Moscow, living in a cheap furnished room not far from the Garden Ring. Here, according to investigative data, she met with former members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, from both right and left wings. Many of them, recently allies of the Bolsheviks, became their enemies after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Return to the socialist revolutionary underground. According to the memoirs of a former SR combatant named L. Benediktov, Fanny sought any opportunity to return to the cause, but did not want to be just an observer. She visited safe houses where plans for uprisings, actions against Bolshevik commissars, and sabotage of weapons supplies were discussed. Some historians claim that Kaplan remained a supporter of the party's combat tactics. Despite the almost total loss of vision, she did not renounce the idea of political terror as a method of struggle. At the same time, her authority among the fighters was high. The past attempt on the Governor-General of Kiev made her a legend of the SR circles. Versions of the first plans to eliminate Lenin. Investigative documents indicate that as early as the spring of 1918, there was talk in Moscow and Petrograd about the necessity to remove Lenin. Kaplan's participation in these conversations has not been definitively proven, but a number of witnesses claimed she was present at some meetings. In the case files, a phrase allegedly spoken by Kaplan among associates is preserved. He betrayed the revolution, turned it into tyranny. "We fought for freedom and received a new throne and a new czar." Investigators used these words as indirect evidence of her motivation. There is another version. Kaplan's participation in the conspiracy was minimal, and her name appeared in the case only because she became a convenient figure for accusation. Later researchers found contradictions in witness statements. Some said they saw her at a meeting in June. Others claimed she was in Kiev at the time. Contacts with key figures in the case. Among the people with whom Fanny maintained contact, famous SR figures are mentioned: Boris Savinkov, Maria Spiridonova, and Yakov Blumkin. All of them at different times spoke in favor of radical measures against the Bolshevik dictatorship. Some interrogation protocols, preserved in the GPU archives, record meetings between Kaplan and people from the circle of Blumkin, who participated in the murder of the German ambassador Mirbach. The investigation tried to link the attempt on Lenin with this episode, claiming that Kaplan was part of the same underground network. However, there is no direct evidence of her participation in these operations. The protocols are contradictory. Some witnesses claimed she discussed the possible removal of Lenin. Others denied that such conversations ever took place in her presence. Psychological portrait before the attempt. According to contemporaries' memoirs, by this time Fanny was physically exhausted and mentally broken. She lived from hand to mouth, was often sick, and experienced severe headaches due to her traumatized eyes. In one of the interrogations, a few days after the attempt, she spoke the words that became famous. In one of the interrogations, a few days after the attempt, she spoke the words that became famous. "I decided to kill Lenin because he betrayed the revolution." Investigators tried to find out who pushed her to this decision, but Fanny claimed she acted alone, by the command of heart and conscience. Historians still argue whether she was part of a conspiracy or a lone revolutionary. In favor of the conspiracy version are her connections with the socialist revolutionaries and the general mood of the underground. Against it, the lack of direct evidence and her own confessions of acting independently. Thus, by the summer of 1918, Fanny Kaplan was again in the thick of the revolutionary struggle. She returned to the underground, was surrounded by people ready for political terror, and lived with the feeling that freedom and justice had been betrayed by the new power. This was the road leading her to the dramatic events of the 27th of August, 1918, when Russian history would forever link Kaplan's name with the attempt on Lenin. The day of the shots. Chronology of the attempt on Lenin. On the 27th of August, 1918, Moscow lived in anxiety and expectation. The city hummed with rumors of the impending Red Terror, of mutinies, and of planned actions against the Bolsheviks. On this day, Vladimir Lenin intended to speak at the Michelson plant, where a meeting of workers was taking place. For Fanny Kaplan, the morning began with restless sleep and a short preparation. According to witness testimony, she left her room around 10 o'clock in the morning, dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair gathered under a headscarf. In her hands, a bag in which, according to investigative data, was a Browning revolver. The final path to the Michelson plant. According to the memoirs of a roommate, Kaplan was unusually silent that day. She left without saying where she was going. Later, the investigation established that she moved by tram and then walked part of the way. Several witnesses claimed to have seen her near the plant half an hour before Lenin's arrival. She stood alone, leaning slightly on a cane, occasionally raising her head as if listening to the voices of the crowd. Her eyesight was almost completely gone. Lenin's appearance and the atmosphere of the meeting. Lenin arrived at the plant around 6 o'clock in the evening. He was met with enthusiasm, shouts of "Long live Ilyich," flags, and workers crowding around the improvised podium. He spoke for about half an hour, calling for mobilization at the front and a struggle against sabotage. According to various sources, Kaplan at this time was standing not far from the building's exit, along Lenin's path to the car. Almost no one noticed her. A short woman in dark clothes blended in with the crowd. The moment of the shots. According to the official version, when Lenin came out and headed for the car, Kaplan approached him to a distance of 3 or 4 steps and fired 3 shots. 2 bullets hit, one in the shoulder, the other in the neck. The third, according to some reports, grazed the car on a ricochet. Eyewitnesses described the chaos that arose at that moment. Shouts, panic, some falling to the ground, others rushing in different directions. Lenin, despite his wounds, managed to take a few more steps and even tried to say something before losing consciousness. Arrest in the first minutes of interrogation. Kaplan was detained almost immediately. She was surrounded by workers and Red Army soldiers. She did not try to flee, calmly saying, "I have done my part." They found a revolver during a search, but people subsequently argued about whether it was truly her weapon or planted by the investigation. In the first hours of interrogation, according to the protocols, she refused to name accomplices, stating, "I acted alone." The investigator tried to find out where she got the weapon and who informed her of Lenin's arrival, but her answers were evasive. Some sources claim she repeated the same phrase, "I shot him because Lenin betrayed the revolution." This became the basis for the official version of her motivation. Contradictions and doubts in the investigation's version. Historians note that witness statements were contradictory. Some claim to have seen exactly how Kaplan fired, others that the shots came from the other side of the crowd. Later, versions appeared that someone else fired, and Kaplan was the victim of a hasty accusation, convenient for the new power that wanted to show its determination to fight the socialist revolutionaries. Some researchers point out that given her almost total blindness, accurate shooting from 3 to 4 meters was extremely difficult. However, the official version was solidified in history. Fanny Kaplan, the perpetrator of the assassination attempt on the leader of the revolution. Consequences of the attempt. Lenin was urgently taken to the Kremlin. Doctors were removing bullets all night. His life hung by a thread, which subsequently became the reason for the start of the Red Terror. Mass repressions against the political opponents of the Bolsheviks. And Fanny Kaplan, exhausted, calm, and silent, was already in the Lubyanka prison, where she faced new interrogations and accusations of participating in a large socialist revolutionary conspiracy. Kaplan's interrogations, mysterious confessions and silence. The night after the attempt on Lenin was long and anxious. While the Kremlin doctors fought for the life of the revolutionary leader, the first interrogation of Fanny Kaplan was taking place in the Lubyanka prison. Historians still argue about how reliable the protocols of those hours are, and what in them was the result of pressure or staging. First hours in prison. Fanny was brought to Lubyanka around 9 o'clock in the evening. She was led into a cell where 2 Chekists and an investigator were already waiting. The woman looked calm and did not resist. According to the memories of a security officer, she sat motionless on a chair, looking into the void. She could barely see what was happening because of her severe vision loss. The first question was direct. "Did you shoot Lenin?" The answer came quietly. "Yes, I fired the shots." Thus began a series of interrogations that lasted 3 days and nights. The investigations version. Investigators tried to build the accusation within the framework of the myth that already existed in the country about a socialist revolutionary conspiracy. They needed to prove that the attempt was not a lone action, but part of a large-scale counter-revolutionary campaign against the Bolsheviks. Kaplan mentioned that she became disillusioned with the Soviet power after the October Revolution. She believed that the Bolsheviks stole the revolution from the people and established a dictatorship far from the ideals for which she fought. But to questions about accomplices, she answered invariably, "I acted alone. No one sent me." The protocols of these interrogations have been preserved fragmentarily, but they contain many contradictions. In one, it is said that she confessed to preparing the attempt in advance. In another, it is as if she decided to shoot at the last moment. The marksman's accuracy and Kaplan's physical condition. The main contradiction of the investigation is Kaplan's vision. Back in her youth, while serving her sentence in hard labor, she survived an accident while handling a bomb, as a result of which she nearly went blind. She saw extremely poorly, distinguishing only light and silhouettes. Experts noted, in such a condition, hitting a target from 3 to 4 meters was incredibly difficult. Many historians believe that the accurate shots that hit Lenin indicate either a chance hit or the participation of another shooter, whose role was never determined. However, during interrogations, Kaplan answered dryly, "I fired the shots. I took the revolver from a socialist revolutionary acquaintance. I cannot name his name." Psychological pressure. According to contemporary stories, Cheka interrogation methods in 1918 were rarely soft. There is no mention of torture in the protocols, but the abrupt change in testimony, the pauses, Fanny's silence, and her refusal to give many explanations speak of strong psychological pressure. In one of the night conversations, the investigator asked, "Do you understand that because of you, terror may begin, and blood will flow like a river?" The answer was strangely calm. Blood is already flowing. Lenin is the source of this blood. This confession became one of the key phrases later widely distributed in the Soviet press. Discrepancies in testimony. Witnesses who saw the moment of the shots claimed different things. Some saw a woman shooting from close range, others as if the shots came from the flank of the crowd. Some said that Fanny stood motionless at the moment of the attempt, and a man next to her was shooting. The investigation ignored these discrepancies, promoting a convenient version. The attempt was committed by a lone socialist revolutionary woman, an enemy of Soviet power. Final protocols. The third day of interrogations ended with the wording of the charge. Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary, confessed to committing an attempt on the life of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, acting for political reasons. At the same time, the name of the accomplices never sounded. The weapon and the way it was obtained were explained evasively, and the motive was reduced to general dissatisfaction with the Bolsheviks. A few hours after these interrogations, no more were conducted. Fanny Kaplan's fate was decided. Kaplan's final hours, truth and legends. Fanny Kaplan spent only 3 days in detention after her final interrogation. Her fate was decided quickly, and already on the morning of the 3rd of September, 1918, Lubyanka was preparing for the final removal of the terrorist. But historians still argue, what was happening during these hours? And did Kaplan really die in the way the official version claimed? Secret order. The decision on the execution was made at the highest level. Lenin remained between life and death, and the attempt became the reason for the launch of the Red Terror. The Cheka demanded swift retribution to show the power of the government and to avenge their leader. No trial or open hearing was held. The interrogation protocols became the formal basis for the sentence. According to the Chekist Yakov Peters, everything was done out of revolutionary necessity, without legal formalities. In the evening of the 2nd of September, a verbal order was given. Execute tomorrow, without noise. Last morning in the cell. Only one testimony from a prison guard remains who saw Kaplan before her last day. He claimed that the woman was calm, silent, and seemed resigned to the outcome. She refused food, asking only for water. She left a note in her cell, allegedly with her last words. "I acted alone. I am happy to die for freedom." Historians argue whether this note is authentic or written by Chekists for future propaganda. The place of execution. The official version states that Fanny Kaplan was shot in the courtyard of the Kremlin, and her body was burned in an iron barrel to avoid possible demonstrations or a cult of memory. But inconsistencies begin here. Some Chekists later said that Kaplan was not shot by firing squad, but killed with a bullet to the back of the head. Others, that she was not burned, but secretly buried in a mass grave. Later versions even claim the execution could have been a staging, and Fanny was sent to secret exile to hide the real organizers of the attempt. However, there is no evidence for this. Reaction of society. Soviet newspapers came out with loud headlines. Assassination uncovered. SR terrorist executed. The publications emphasized that the Bolshevik power was implacable toward the enemies of the revolution. At the same time, neither photographs, nor the exact place of execution, nor witness testimony were published. The official version was built on a single phrase: "The execution has been carried out." On the streets of Moscow, rumors multiplied. Some claimed they saw how a woman was secretly taken from the prison at night. Others whispered that the executed woman was not Kaplan at all, but another prisoner. Propaganda effect. The event became a turning point for the Soviet power. Already on the 4th of September, newspapers announced the beginning of the Red Terror, mass repressions against everyone suspected of anti-Soviet activity. The attempt on Lenin and Kaplan's name were used as a symbol of the danger coming from the bourgeoisie, socialist revolutionaries, and white guards. Historians believe that Kaplan was turned into a convenient image of the enemy. Little was said about her personality. Her real motives and connections were not investigated. It was more important to show the people that the attempt was not a private case, but the result of a conspiracy against the revolution. A mystery not fully solved. The Cheka archives related to this case remain closed or heavily edited. The original interrogation protocols have disappeared. There are no original documents about the execution, only late testimonies that contradict each other. Today, the versions of her fate can be divided into three. Official: shot and burned in the Kremlin. Secret exile: a staged execution and a hidden transfer to a remote camp. Substitution of the shooter. Kaplan was used as a convenient culprit, and Lenin's real killer was not found. Each of these versions has weak points, but the official version is also far from complete transparency. The story ended quickly, but the questions about Fanny Kaplan remained forever. Who was she really? A fanatical terrorist, a pawn in someone else's game, or a victim of political intrigue? The answers to these questions have never been given. The Ghost of Kaplan: How the Power Created an Image of the Enemy. Fanny Kaplan lived a short life, but her name outlived her death by decades. After the attempt on Lenin and the quick execution, the image of a female terrorist became a political tool. The Soviet power used her figure as a symbol of the danger of the revolution's enemies, as a justification for terror, and as a bogeyman for future generations. In this chapter, we will break down how the myth of Kaplan was created, strengthened, and passed down from era to era. First effect: the attempt as a political resource. Within hours after the shots in Moscow, the Bolsheviks realized that the event could be used to strengthen their power. The attempt was presented as the result of a wide conspiracy of right socialist revolutionaries and counter-revolutionary forces. The press inflated the story. Headlines talked about how the Socialist Revolutionary Party is waging war against the people, and how the bourgeoisie shoots at the revolution through the hands of terrorists. Kaplan herself was called obsessed, a mad killer, and her personal history was presented in a distorted way. Many real facts about her life were hidden. Her biography was rewritten under a convenient scenario. Start of the Red Terror. On the 3rd of September, 1918, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee issued a decree on the Red Terror. It allowed for mass arrests, extrajudicial executions, and the creation of camps for political prisoners. In official messages, the reason for the terror was precisely the attempt on Lenin. Kaplan's name became proof that the enemies of the revolution act ruthlessly. Therefore, the revolution has the right to a ruthless response. In essence, a single shot became the basis for repressions that affected tens of thousands of people. Court processes and the Socialist Revolutionary Case. In 1919, the Bolsheviks arranged a show trial against the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Although Kaplan herself was already dead by that time, her name sounded in the accusatory speeches as a symbol of the entire anti-Soviet struggle. Prosecutors claimed that she acted on the instructions of the Socialist revolutionaries, although they presented no direct evidence of this. During the trial, letters and testimonies allegedly found after her death were used, but their authenticity was doubtful. Historians believe that part of these materials was fabricated by the Cheka. Transformation into a legend. In the 1920s, Kaplan's name entered school textbooks. There she was described as a beast in human form, a freak of the bourgeoisie. Official biographies of Lenin often included dramatic scenes of the attempt, where Kaplan was depicted as an almost demonic figure, a fanatic who hated the Soviet power without any reason. Facts of her youth: participation in the revolutionary movement and suffering in hard labor were silenced. Such an image helped show that the enemies of socialism are always senselessly cruel, and the revolution is forced to defend itself. Rumors and counter-legends. In parallel, alternative versions circulated in society. Rumors claimed that Kaplan was only a cover, and that the real shooter was never found. Some said that the attempt was organized by the Bolsheviks themselves to justify mass repressions. These rumors were never printed in the press, but they lived in the conversations of the intelligentsia and emigrants. Books appeared abroad talking about a staged trial and a political setup. Use of Kaplan's name in subsequent decades. In the 1930s, during the Great Terror, Kaplan's name was again invoked to justify mass purges. Propaganda claimed, "We remember how the enemies shot Lenin. We will not allow the enemies of socialism to shoot again." During the war years, the story of Kaplan was almost never mentioned. But after Stalin's death, it was again included in the course of Soviet history as a lesson that the enemies of socialism are immortal. Even in the 70s, school children learned that the attempt was the result of the bestial hatred of the bourgeoisie. Kaplan's name became a symbol of an abstract enemy, and the real events and facts of her biography were finally lost. Closed archives and late revelations. After the collapse of the USSR, researchers gained partial access to the Cheka archives. It turned out that many materials on the Kaplan case were either destroyed or edited. The interrogation protocols are incomplete. The handwriting of different investigators is present, and there are many contradictions. There is not a single document with Lenin's signature confirming that he personally demanded the execution. There is also no evidence of Kaplan's connection with the socialist revolutionary leadership. This allowed historians to suggest that the entire story was largely fabricated and used as a tool for intimidating the population. Summary: the created enemy. Fanny Kaplan's name became a political symbol rather than a historical fact. Her biography was distorted, and her figure was turned into a bogeyman. The real woman with a tragic fate disappeared, giving way to a propaganda myth. Thus, the attempt, about which very little reliable information is known, became the justification for one of the bloodiest periods in Soviet history. Shots in the mist. The truth of the attempt we never learned. The history of the attempt on Vladimir Lenin in August 1918 remains one of the most tangled and controversial pages of Soviet history. More than a century later, we have only shards of truth, distorted by time, politics, and fear. The finale of our investigation is an attempt to gather these shards and answer the main question: who shot Lenin and why? Official version: the SR conspiracy. According to the Cheka protocols, Fanny Kaplan committed the attempt on the instructions of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. She supposedly hated the Bolsheviks for the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and decided to take revenge by killing the leader of the new power. This version was immediately presented as an axiom: newspapers, leaflets, and show interrogations. But with careful analysis, the documents raise a mass of questions. There is no direct evidence of Kaplan's connection with the socialist revolutionary leadership after her release from hard labor. Many protocols are signed not by her, but by investigators. The weapon from which Kaplan supposedly fired was not found, and eyewitness accounts contradicted each other. Historians today consider this version a political order, convenient for the Bolsheviks, who required a justification for repressions against the opposition. The lone avenger version. Some researchers believe that Kaplan acted alone, driven by personal hatred for Lenin and his politics. It is known that after hard labor, she was disappointed in all parties, considering the revolution betrayed. In letters to friends, she mentioned that it was not for power that we fought, but for freedom, and now there is no freedom. But the question arises: could a woman, blind in one eye and seeing poorly with the other, shoot accurately in the twilight and hit her target? According to official data, she fired 3 shots, 2 of which wounded Lenin. Ballistic expertise was never conducted, and witnesses claimed the shots were fired from different points. The Cheka provocation version. This is the most controversial, but also the most discussed version. According to it, the attempt was staged or allowed by the Bolshevik special services to cause a wave of hatred toward the socialist revolutionaries and any opponents of Lenin, obtain justification for the Red Terror, which began only a few days later, strengthen the cult of the leader, who miraculously survived after the attempt. This version is based on a number of facts. Evidence that Kaplan fired is absent. She was executed without trial, destroying the main witness. The investigation was completed in hours, without expert assessments or face-to-face confrontations. Even some Czechists in their memoirs wrote that the Kaplan case was botched on orders from above. Mysterious details that no version explains. Eyewitnesses heard not 3, but 5 shots. Bullets of 2 different calibers were found at the scene of the attempt. Lenin, according to doctors, received wounds incompatible with the Browning pistol that Kaplan supposedly had. Or, after the execution, her body was burned and the ashes scattered. Although terrorists were usually buried secretly, but in certain places. All these facts create a sense that the story was hurriedly rewritten, depriving us of a chance to learn the real truth. History without a final point. Today we know only one thing. The attempt on Lenin became a turning point in the history of the young Soviet power. It became the formal reason for the terror that took tens of thousands of lives. Fanny Kaplan's name was turned into a symbol of the enemy. Her biography was rewritten, and her fate was hidden under layers of propaganda. Whether she was a fanatical killer, a pawn in a political game, or an innocent victim, history has not answered. As one of the later investigators who became familiar with the surviving Cheka files said, "The more you read these documents, the less you understand who shot Lenin. But you understand one thing. Someone very much did not want us to know the truth." And perhaps the mystery of the shots in the courtyard of the Michelson plant will remain with us forever, as a reminder that in revolutions, they shoot not only from pistols, but also from words, lies, and fear. So, the story of Fanny Kaplan remains a mystery behind 7 seals, and the truth about those shots is perhaps forever lost in the archives of the past. We've only tried to reconstruct the chain of events and show how one woman, one bullet, and one moment changed the course of history for an entire country. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and click the bell icon so you don't miss new dark narratives about the secrets of the USSR. Momart.